It was a bright, peaceful morning on the edge of town. Farmer Jack stood on his porch, sipping his coffee and admiring the view of his sprawling farmland. His animals roamed freely, the smell of freshly cut hay lingered in the air, and the sound of chirping birds added a serene touch to the scene. Little did he know, this calm would soon be shattered by a storm in the form of his entitled neighbor, Karen. Karen wasn't your average neighbor. She was the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics, the type who believed her vision of perfection was the only one that mattered. A recent transplant from the city, she despised the countryside's charm. To her, it was primitive, chaotic, and worst of all ugly. She had moved into the nearby suburban neighborhood, governed by a strict HOA, and had taken it upon herself to restore order to the area, starting with Jack's farm. Driving her pristine SUV, Karen pulled up to the edge of Jack's property, her face twisted in disgust. She parked, slammed the door, and marched toward the fence with the air of someone about to deliver a royal decree. Jack noticed her approach but remained calm, leaning on the fence with his weathered hands. "You, farmer," Karen barked, pointing a manicured finger at him. "This farm is an eyesore. Your barn is a hideous monstrosity, and those animals are noisy and filthy. This is a respectable neighborhood, and you're ruining it." Jack raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Good morning to you too. Can I help you with something specific?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "I'm with the HOA, and I've had numerous complaints about your so-called farm. It's a health hazard and completely out of place here. I'm giving you a chance to take it down voluntarily before I escalate this." Jack chuckled, his voice steady and calm. "Ma'am, this farm's been here for generations. It predates your HOA by a good 100 years. I'm well within my rights to run it, and I intend to keep it that way." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. "We'll see about that," she hissed before storming off, already dialing a number on her phone. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. Jack shook his head, amused but not surprised. The police arrived quickly, stepping out of their squad car with bemused expressions. They had received a call about supposed animal cruelty and illegal farming activities. One of the officers, a young man named Officer Mitchell, approached Jack with a polite nod. "Morning, sir. We got a call about some concerns on your property. Mind if we take a look around?" "Of course," Jack said, gesturing for them to follow. "You're welcome to check anything you want. The animals are well-fed and healthy, and everything here is perfectly legal." The officers conducted a thorough inspection, checking the animals, the barn, and the crops. As expected, they found nothing amiss. Officer Mitchell walked back to Karen, who was standing on the roadside, arms crossed and smirking triumphantly. "Ma'am," he said, "everything here is up to code. There's no evidence of any wrongdoing." Karen's smug expression faltered. "What? That can't be right. Look at this place. It's disgusting. How can you allow this to exist next to our neighborhood?" Officer Mitchell sighed. "Ma'am, this farm is legally operated and predates your neighborhood. There's nothing we can do. Please refrain from making false reports in the future, or you'll face consequences for wasting police resources." Jack nodded politely as the officers left, but Karen's eyes blazed with fury. She clenched her fists, glaring at Jack. "You may have won this round, but this isn't over. I'll make sure your little farm is shut down for good." Over the next few days, Karen launched a campaign of harassment. She filed multiple complaints with the HOA, accusing Jack of everything from noise pollution to illegal crop growing. Each complaint was more absurd than the last, but Karen was relentless. She even stood at the edge of his property, filming the animals and loudly narrating her grievances for social media. Jack's patience wore thin, but he refused to engage in her petty antics. Instead, he focused on his work, confident that the truth would prevail. His calm demeanor only fueled Karen's obsession further. Determined to escalate things, she convened an emergency HOA meeting, where she presented her fabricated evidence of Jack's alleged violations. The HOA president, Mr. Thompson, was a mild-mannered man who preferred to avoid conflict. Reluctantly, he agreed to send an official complaint to Jack, warning him to comply with HOA standards, even though Jack wasn't subject to their rules. Karen's victory seemed within reach. However, Jack was not one to be intimidated. He knew his rights and was prepared to fight back. He called his lawyer to confirm what he already knew. His farm was untouchable by the HOA. Still, he decided to play it cool for now, watching and waiting for Karen to make her next move. It didn't take long. Karen, frustrated by the lack of immediate results, decided to call the police again. This time, she reported that the animals were being mistreated and that the farm was operating without the proper permits. The police, now familiar with Karen's antics, arrived with far less urgency than before. Officer Mitchell, who had handled the previous complaint, shook his head when he saw Karen waiting at the roadside. "Again," he muttered. He walked over to Jack, who was calmly feeding his chickens. "Mr. Jack, mind if we do another inspection?" "Not at all," Jack replied with a smile. As expected, the inspection revealed nothing. Officer Mitchell walked back to Karen, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, this is the second time we've been called out here for baseless complaints. If it happens again, you will be fined for making false reports." Karen's face turned pale, but her stubbornness refused to let her back down. She sneered at Jack. "Enjoy your little victory while it lasts. This isn't over." Jack chuckled to himself as Karen stormed away. He knew this was far from over, but he also knew that karma had a funny way of catching up with people like Karen. For now, he would wait, confident that her obsession would ultimately be her downfall. Karen seethed with rage as she stomped back to her house. She had never lost a battle before, at least not one she was willing to acknowledge. But this farmer, with his calm demeanor and refusal to bend to her will, had sparked a fire in her that wouldn't burn out easily. She was determined to escalate her war on the farm. If legal action wouldn't shut him down, then a good dose of petty tactics would surely break him. The very next day, Karen launched her campaign with full force. She started small, filing more complaints with the HOA about Jack's farm. Noise pollution, foul odors, illegal crop growing. No claim was too ridiculous for her. She sent emails, made phone calls, and even posted on the neighborhood's social media group about the horrors of living next to an unsanitary farm. Her posts were dramatic and filled with exaggerations. "I can't even open my windows without being assaulted by the smell of manure. What if these animals spread diseases? This farm is a ticking time bomb." At first, a few neighbors sympathized with her plight. Nobody wanted to live next to a potential health hazard. But as Karen's complaints grew more extreme, people started questioning her motives. The smell she kept mentioning? Hardly noticeable. The noise from the animals? Barely louder than the wind rustling through the trees. It didn't take long for the community to see that Karen wasn't trying to protect the neighborhood. She just hated the farm. But Karen wasn't one to give up easily. When words didn't work, she turned to more devious methods. Late at night, under the cover of darkness, she crept onto the edge of Jack's property and threw bags of garbage over the fence. Rotten vegetables, old newspapers, and empty bottles littered the once pristine farmland. Jack discovered the mess the next morning. His expression darkened for a moment, but then he simply sighed, grabbed a shovel, and cleaned it up without a word. Karen watched from her window, expecting a reaction, an outburst perhaps, or a call to the police. But Jack remained calm, frustrating her even more. A few nights later, Karen escalated again. This time, she tampered with the farm's water supply, cutting the irrigation line that fed the crops. When Jack found the broken pipe, he knew it wasn't an accident. Still, he quietly repaired the damage and installed security cameras around the property. If Karen thought she could scare him into leaving, she was sorely mistaken. Unaware of the cameras, Karen continued her antics. She threw more garbage, tampered with the fence, and even sprayed a foul-smelling liquid near the barn, hoping it would drive the animals away. But this time, Jack had her on tape. He watched the footage with a grim smile. It was time to let Karen dig her own grave. Meanwhile, Karen kept up her public crusade. She organized an emergency HOA meeting to address what she called the farm crisis. She printed out pictures of the farm, carefully angled to make it look as messy and chaotic as possible, and presented them to the HOA board. "This is what we're living next to," she declared dramatically. "It's a breeding ground for disease. If we don't do something, our property values will plummet, and this whole neighborhood will turn into a disaster zone." The HOA president, Mr. Thompson, was visibly uncomfortable. He had been dragged into Karen's feud reluctantly and wasn't keen on escalating it further. Still, under pressure from Karen, he agreed to send a formal complaint to Jack. Jack received the letter a few days later. He read it over with a chuckle, crumpled it up, and tossed it into the trash. The HOA had no jurisdiction over his farm, and he wasn't about to let Karen intimidate him. Undeterred, Karen ramped up her campaign. She went door to door, trying to rally support from the neighbors. But by now, most of them had grown tired of her antics. Some politely declined to get involved, while others openly told her to leave Jack alone. Frustrated but determined, Karen decided to call the police again. This time, she reported that the animals were being mistreated and that Jack was illegally growing crops without proper permits. The officers who responded were the same ones who had dealt with her previous complaints. Officer Mitchell sighed as he pulled into the driveway. "Here we go again," he muttered to his partner. Jack greeted them with his usual calm demeanor. "Back so soon, officers? I was just about to brew some coffee. Want a cup?" The officers conducted another inspection, but it was clear they weren't taking Karen's complaints seriously anymore. Everything on the farm was in perfect order, just like before. Officer Mitchell walked back to Karen, who stood with her arms crossed, glaring at the farm like it had personally insulted her. "Ma'am," Officer Mitchell said, "we've done another thorough inspection, and once again there are no violations. If you continue to make false reports, you'll be charged with harassment and wasting police resources." Karen's face went pale, but she quickly regained her composure. "This is a conspiracy," she shouted. "He must be bribing you. There's no way this farm is legal." The officers exchanged a look before turning back to Karen. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. If you keep this up, there will be serious consequences." Karen stormed off, muttering under her breath. Jack watched her retreat with a small, satisfied smile. He knew she wasn't done yet, but he also knew her tactics were becoming increasingly desperate. Word of Karen's antics began to spread beyond the neighborhood. The local Farmers Association caught wind of what was happening and decided to show their support. One afternoon, a group of farmers gathered outside Jack's property, holding signs that read "Support Local Farms" and "Farmers Feed America." Karen was livid. She stood on her porch, watching the peaceful demonstration with barely contained rage. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had expected the community to rally behind her, not turn against her. Despite the mounting pressure, Karen refused to back down. She doubled down on her efforts, convinced that if she just pushed a little harder, she could force Jack out. But she had no idea that Jack had been collecting evidence against her all along. The security footage, the police reports, the formal complaints, all of it was about to come crashing down on her. Karen believed she was still in control, but the truth was, her reign of petty terror was on borrowed time. Jack was ready, and karma was waiting just around the corner. The tide was turning, and Karen had no idea. For months, she had waged her petty war on Jack's farm, convinced that her relentless complaints and underhanded tactics would finally force him to give up. She had thrown everything she could at him: false police reports, sabotage, and public humiliation. But what Karen didn't know was that the game had changed. Jack wasn't just sitting back anymore. He was preparing to strike. Quietly and methodically, he had gathered an arsenal of evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash karma on the woman who had turned his life into a circus. The first crack in Karen's fortress came when Jack decided to share his story with the local newspaper. At first, he was hesitant. He wasn't one to air his problems in public. But after consulting with his lawyer and showing him the security footage of Karen's late-night sabotage, the lawyer convinced him that public exposure might be the key to ending her reign of terror. The headline hit the town like a thunderclap. "Local farmer targeted by HOA bully, a modern-day David versus Goliath." The article detailed everything, from Karen's false police reports to the recorded footage of her vandalizing Jack's property. The security camera stills were printed in full color, showing Karen sneaking onto Jack's farm in the dead of night with a garbage bag in hand. By noon, the story had gone viral. Social media exploded with outrage, with hashtags like #FarmFreedom and #KarenVersusFarm trending. The comments came fast and furious. "This is why nobody likes HOAs. Support local farmers. This Karen needs to be stopped. Imagine being so bored you start a war with a farm. Unreal." Karen's carefully curated image of suburban perfection was crumbling in real time. She tried to defend herself online, claiming that Jack had manipulated the footage and that she was only protecting the neighborhood. But the damage was done. The more she tried to explain, the worse it got. People began digging into her past, uncovering a long history of frivolous complaints and disputes with former neighbors. One local business owner even shared how Karen's false accusations had once nearly shut down his shop. While the town buzzed with the unfolding drama, Karen's troubles were far from over. The local police, already fed up with her constant false reports, decided it was time to take action. Officer Mitchell arrived at Karen's house with a serious expression and a summons in hand. "Ms. Karen," he said, You're being charged with harassment, vandalism, and filing false police reports. You'll need to appear in court." Karen's jaw dropped. "What? This is ridiculous. I'm the victim here." Officer Mitchell sighed. "You've been given multiple warnings. We have footage, eyewitness accounts, and a long paper trail of complaints that prove otherwise. I suggest you get a lawyer." The news spread like wildfire, and by the time Karen showed up for her court appearance, the courtroom was packed with curious onlookers. Jack sat calmly on the plaintiff's side, his lawyer standing confidently beside him. Karen, on the other hand, looked rattled. Gone was her usual bravado. She knew she was in trouble. Jack's lawyer presented the case with precision, laying out a timeline of Karen's harassment, complete with video evidence and police reports. The judge listened carefully, her expression growing sterner with each new piece of evidence. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she stumbled through a series of excuses, blaming Jack, the HOA, and even the local government for her actions. But the judge wasn't buying it. "Ms. Karen," the judge said, her voice firm, "you've shown a pattern of malicious behavior toward Mr. Jack and his property. Your actions were not only illegal, but entirely unjustified. I'm ordering you to pay damages to Mr. Jack for the vandalism and harassment. Furthermore, you'll be fined for wasting police resources and will be placed on probation. Do I make myself clear?" Karen nodded, her face pale. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in whispers as the verdict was handed down. Jack smiled politely, nodding to the judge in gratitude. It was a victory, not just for him but for every person who had ever been bullied by someone like Karen. The aftermath of the court case was brutal for Karen. Word spread quickly, and she became the talk of the town, not in the way she had always imagined. Neighbors who once tolerated her antics now avoided her altogether. Her social media accounts were flooded with sarcastic comments and farm-themed memes. Even the HOA, the very institution Karen had once ruled with an iron fist, turned against her. The board voted to remove her from her position, citing her gross misuse of authority and behavior unbecoming of an HOA representative. With her reputation in tatters and legal bills piling up, Karen was forced to sell her house and leave the neighborhood. The woman who had once tried to destroy the farm was now packing her belongings in silence, her world collapsing around her. But Jack wasn't one for holding grudges. A few weeks later, as he stood by his fence, he noticed Karen's moving truck idling in the driveway. She glanced over, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. Jack raised a hand in a friendly wave. "Take care of yourself, Karen." For a second, Karen looked as though she might say something, but instead, she nodded and climbed into her SUV. As she drove away, Jack couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity. He wasn't a cruel man. He had only wanted to be left alone to tend his farm. With Karen gone, peace returned to the neighborhood. Jack's farm became something of a local landmark, a symbol of resilience and the triumph of calm over chaos. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now stopped by for fresh produce and a friendly chat. To celebrate the end of the ordeal, Jack threw a small gathering at the farm. His friends, neighbors, and supporters came together, laughing and sharing stories. At the center of it all was Jack, raising a glass in a toast. "To good neighbors," he said with a grin, "and to knowing when to stand your ground." The crowd erupted in cheers, and for the first time in months, Jack felt completely at ease. The battle was over, and karma had delivered its verdict. Peace was finally restored to the farm, and Jack knew one thing for certain. No storm, no matter how petty or entitled, could ever take him down. Karen's departure should have been the end of the saga, but in a strange twist of fate, it was only the beginning of her humbling lesson. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was peaceful. Jack returned to his daily routine, tending to his crops and caring for his animals without the constant stress of Karen's harassment. His farm flourished, becoming a local favorite for fresh produce and homemade jams. But while Jack was moving forward, Karen was on a downward spiral she never anticipated. After selling her house at a significant loss, Karen moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Gone were the days of suburban luxury and her self-proclaimed title of neighborhood queen. The reality of her new life hit her hard. No more meticulously manicured lawns, no more HOA meetings to control, and worst of all, no one to boss around. It didn't take long for Karen to realize how much she had lost. At first, she tried to maintain her old habits. She complained to the apartment manager about the noisy tenants next door, called animal control on a neighbor's cat for staring aggressively at her through the window, and left passive-aggressive notes in the laundry room. But unlike in her old neighborhood, no one cared. In fact, most of the tenants ignored her entirely. The apartment manager gave her a curt warning. One more complaint and you're out. For the first time, Karen was powerless, and it stung more than she thought possible. Meanwhile, Jack's farm was thriving like never before. The media coverage had turned him into something of a local celebrity. Schools brought kids on field trips to learn about farming, local restaurants sourced fresh ingredients from his fields, and community events were held on the farm's lush green pastures. Jack remained humble through it all, always crediting his success to his family's hard work and the support of the community. One day, while Jack was manning a small produce stand at the local farmer's market, a familiar face appeared in the crowd, Karen. She looked different. Gone was the polished, intimidating woman who once stood at the edge of his property, barking orders. She seemed smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her eyes downcast. Jack watched as she hesitated near his stand, her hands nervously clutching her purse. "Karen," Jack said, his tone kind but cautious. She looked up, startled. For a moment, she seemed ready to turn and run, but then she sighed and nodded. "Hi, Jack." Jack smiled, leaning on the counter. "What brings you here?" Karen shifted uncomfortably. I saw your stand, and I thought I'd stop by. You've done well for yourself. The farm looks amazing." "Thanks," Jack said, genuinely surprised by her tone. "It's been a good year." Karen hesitated, her eyes scanning the fresh produce on display. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly. "For everything. I was wrong about the farm, about you, about a lot of things. I let my ego get the better of me, and it cost me more than I expected." Jack studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It takes a lot of courage to admit that. Apology accepted." Karen blinked, clearly not expecting such an easy forgiveness. "Really? Just like that? Life's too short to hold grudges," Jack said. "Besides, we've all made mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them." Karen offered a tentative smile. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of genuine relief. She bought a basket of fresh vegetables, thanked Jack, and walked away with a lighter heart. Jack watched her go, hoping that her words were sincere. He wasn't naive. He knew people didn't change overnight, but something about her seemed different this time. Maybe, just maybe, she had finally learned her lesson. Over the next few months, Karen kept a low profile. She volunteered at the community garden, attended local events, and even helped organize a charity drive for the Farmers Association. Slowly but surely, her reputation began to recover. People started seeing her not as the infamous HOA tyrant, but as someone trying to make amends. The ultimate sign of change came a year later when Karen approached Jack with a surprising proposal. She wanted to help organize a fall festival on the farm, a celebration of local farmers and community spirit. At first, Jack was skeptical, but after seeing the genuine enthusiasm in her eyes, he agreed. The festival was a resounding success. Families came from all over the county to enjoy hayrides, pumpkin carving, and farm-fresh food. Karen worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating volunteers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. By the end of the day, even Jack had to admit she had done a fantastic job. As the sun set over the farm, Jack and Karen stood side by side, watching the last of the festival-goers head home. "You did good," Jack said, tipping his hat to her. Karen smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "Thanks, Jack. I owe you for giving me a second chance. Just don't go starting any more wars," Jack said with a chuckle. Karen laughed, a real, unforced laugh. "I think my days of declaring war on farms are behind me." The two shared a quiet moment of understanding. The feud that had once torn their lives apart was now a distant memory, replaced by a strange but genuine friendship. Jack couldn't help but marvel at how life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. The farm sign that once read Jack's Family Farm was updated shortly after the festival. It now read, "Karma Acres, where nature always wins." It was a fitting tribute to the strange journey that had brought them all together. And as Jack stood on his porch that evening, watching the stars twinkle above the fields, he felt a deep sense of peace. Karen had found her way, the farm was thriving, and the community was stronger than ever. Karma, it seemed, had worked its magic in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes, Jack thought with a smile, karma could be surprisingly sweet.